Story 1. In the 1980s, in an effort to crack down on homosexuals within their ranks, the United States Navy spent millions of dollars investigating a woman known only as Dorothy. Undercover agents discovered that many suspected gay men referenced this name, leading them to believe she might have been a madam who organized gay meetings, and finding her could help them identify many gay men. After several years and millions of dollars spent on the investigation, they determined that questions like, "Are you friends with Dorothy?" served as a means for gay men to identify each other without outing themselves in public. Dorothy never existed. Story 2. It can rain red in places with high iron density. The water is actually drinkable and will not poison you. Story 3. The Central Intelligence Agency attempted to use cats to spy on members of the Soviet Union. A cat underwent an hour-long surgery to insert a radio transmitter in its ear canal. This operation was known as Operation Acoustic Kitty. The plan did not succeed, as the cat was unfortunately run over by a car. Story 4. In 1994, the United States Air Force attempted to develop a non-lethal weapon intended to influence sexual orientation. It was formally referred to as the gay bomb. The concept was that the bomb would contain human sexual pheromones, which would be released upon detonation. The idea was that anyone exposed to the pheromones would theoretically be turned gay, causing them to become infatuated with one another and hesitant to engage in combat, thereby allowing the United States to win future wars. Obviously, this project was never realized, primarily because they could not make it work. It did, however, win a satirical Nobel Peace Prize. Story 5. The Federal Bureau of Investigation spied on Martin Luther King Jr., gathered evidence of an affair he was having, blackmailed him, and tried to convince him to take his own life. Story 6. The United States government paid the Central Intelligence Agency to send agents into random bars and spike people's food and drinks with hallucinogenic drugs such as LSD, mescaline, and liquid THC, and then take notes on what happened. They also paid a person to sit on a toilet drinking martinis while watching individuals have sex with prostitutes on the other side of a one-way mirror. They named it Operation Midnight Climax, as the agents were under the influence of their own supply when they came up with the name. Story 7. The United States has passed a bill that allows for the invasion of the Netherlands in the event of a prosecution by the Hague of a United States service member. Story 8. The Soviets spent millions of dollars to insert several agents into the Pentagon to discover what was happening at the busy meeting place in its center. It was a hot dog stand. Story 9. All the fast food pizza chains source their cheese from the same supplier. Story 10. The major U.S. car companies conspired to have the trolley system in Los Angeles removed after World War II to promote the use of cars. Story 11. U.S. Customs and Border Protection can stop, board, and search any vehicle within 100 miles of the geographical border of the country. They can also detain and search individuals to determine if they are U.S. citizens. Story 12. In the 1950s and 1960s, the United States Army sprayed zinc cadmium sulfide in St. Louis as part of a Cold War-era military experiment to test how biological warfare agents might spread in different environments. The Army sprayed the inorganic compound, which glows bright yellow under ultraviolet light, in 20 residential areas, 13 downtown locations, and 2 5-square-mile sections of the city. The Army used a variety of methods to spray the chemical, including blowers on top of buildings, from the backs of station wagons, and via planes. The Army also sprayed the chemical during Operation Large Area Coverage in 1957 and 1958, which involved dispersing large amounts of zinc cadmium sulfide across the United States. Story 13. The concept of jaywalking was invented by car manufacturers because too many people were dying on the roads. Most people in North America would have considered the road to be public space, not the exclusive right of motorists. There was a concerted lobbying effort by Detroit to seize that public space for the exclusive use of automobile drivers. Story 14. Whoever holds the office of President of Portugal is the leader of the Knights Templar or something similar. When the Templars were excommunicated by the Pope and many were sentenced to death, the King of Portugal at the time, Dinis, offered the Templars refuge in Portugal, partly due to their role in expanding the kingdom southward in Iberia. He postponed their trial and eventually established a new order of Christ that incorporated Templars as members. Portugal, rather than the Church, retained control of the group's finances and lands. Over time, the Order of Christ evolved into a symbolic and military organization, and to this day, the President of Portugal holds the position of its leader. Story 15. The Central Intelligence Agency planned Operation Northwoods as a false flag operation in 1962. They intended to stage a terrorist attack in the United States and blame it on the Cubans as a pretext to invade Cuba. John F. Kennedy rejected the plans. Any further extrapolation from this information may be considered a conspiracy theory, but this is what we have documented evidence for. Story 16. Michelin developed the restaurant rating system to encourage people to travel by car to distant restaurants, leading to a higher frequency of tire replacements. Story 17. Sugar-free gum can help prevent cavities. Chewing sugar-free gum increases saliva production, which neutralizes acids produced by bacteria in the mouth, washes away food particles, and strengthens tooth enamel by delivering minerals like calcium and phosphate. Xylitol, a natural sweetener used in sugar-free gum, can also help prevent cavities. Unlike regular sugar, xylitol is not fermented by oral bacteria, meaning it does not produce the acids that lead to tooth decay. In fact, xylitol can inhibit the growth of cavity-causing bacteria by reducing their ability to adhere to teeth and decreasing their overall presence in the mouth. This makes xylitol-containing gum a safer alternative to sugar-sweetened gum and an active contributor to maintaining oral health. Drilling a cavity does not eliminate the bacteria that cause cavities. It merely addresses the structural damage. Story 18. In the United Arab Emirates and other Gulf countries, there are almost certainly trillionaires. They do not need to announce their wealth publicly like those in the West. Story 19. George Bush's grandfather, Prescott Bush, was involved in an attempted coup in America that failed because the general they tried to make the American leader was experiencing an anti-imperialist epiphany at the time. Story 20. Wealthy individuals often host private gatherings at their extravagant mansions. During these events, they sometimes make decisions that impact thousands of employees. I have never understood how the Bohemian Grove was ever seen as far-fetched. It is just a party where people make plans. Story 21. Up until very recently, one company, De Beers, sold nearly all of the diamonds in the world. To this day, however, they still control about 2/3 of the world's diamond trade. They restrict supply to keep prices high and are the reason diamond engagement rings became popular. While engagement rings occurred occasionally, they were not the standard until De Beers created an advertising campaign. They also set the expectation for pricing. The idea that one should spend a certain portion of their salary originated from them, originally proposed as 1 month's salary but gradually increased. Diamonds are not as valuable as you may think. Sandpaper often contains some diamond dust, and synthetic diamonds are surprisingly inexpensive to produce. Meanwhile, restricted supply and cartel behavior have kept the prices of items like diamond rings much higher than they should be. They also contributed to the distinction between a natural diamond and a synthetic one, even though it is extremely unlikely that one could actually discern the difference. Story 22. In the 1970s, neoconservatives including Donald Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz established a group called Team B to support their belief that the Soviet Union was advancing in the arms race, despite intelligence from the Central Intelligence Agency's Team A indicating otherwise. When they found no evidence, they concluded that the Soviets were so sophisticated they could conceal all of their new weapons. They claimed that the United States submarine fleet was threatened by a new non-acoustic Soviet listening technology, and that the complete absence of evidence for its existence was, paradoxically, proof that it existed. All of this unsubstantiated information was published by the Committee for the Present Danger. In 2002 and 2003, neoconservatives including Donald Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz asserted that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and claimed their confidence in their existence was based on the lack of evidence to disprove them. Story 23. MKUltra, Gulf of Tonkin Incident. Dianne Feinstein's personal driver of 20 years was a Chinese spy. Israel was accused of placing surveillance equipment around the White House. Story 24. Massive sterilization campaigns targeting women from minority groups in the United States and Canada, particularly Native Americans, have occurred. This issue has been notably addressed by the Indian Health Service. Story 25. The war on drugs started as a racist policy of the Nixon administration. One of Richard Nixon's top advisors and a key figure in the Watergate scandal said the war on drugs was created as a political tool to target black people and anti-war activists, according to a 1994 interview with John Ehrlichman published in the April 2016 issue of Harper's Magazine. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies: the anti-war left and black people. Former Nixon domestic policy chief John Ehrlichman told Harper's writer Dan Baum in the April cover story, "You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and black people with heroin, and then heavily criminalizing both, we could disrupt those communities," Ehrlichman said. "We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." Story 26. Operation Mockingbird. Who would have thought that the Central Intelligence Agency would manipulate American media to persuade Americans into accepting their beliefs? There is no way that could still be happening today. Story 27. Everything in the torture report. After September 11th, the Central Intelligence Agency imprisoned and tortured a few hundred people in the Middle East illegally at black sites. The methods they used never worked, and there was already evidence that they did not work upon their introduction in this plan. Story 28. Black individuals were more profitable to rent to than white individuals. Expectations were lower, allowing for subdividing apartments and less maintenance compared to renting to white individuals who had more choices. If developers aimed to rent to black individuals, they would hire individuals with a disheveled appearance to loiter in predominantly white neighborhoods, appearing on street corners with baby strollers or bringing children for trick-or-treating. Some racist white individuals would become alarmed about the perceived decline of the neighborhood and sell their houses at a low price to developers, who would subsequently rent them to black individuals. Story 29. The Democratic National Committee and the Republican National Committee both jointly and privately own the National Committee on Presidential Debates and effectively gatekeep our entire election process. There is virtually no federal oversight over these three private corporations. None of them are legally bound to any sort of charter to provide a clear and free election. See the comment by Democratic National Committee lawyer Bruce Spivia about cigars. Story 30. George H.W. Bush was part of the Central Intelligence Agency and was in Dallas when Kennedy was shot. When asked what he was doing when he heard Kennedy was shot, the ultimate memory everyone has, he says he doesn't remember. Story 31. If I had a penny for everything here that is not related to the United States, I would have about 2 or 3. I did not scroll that far down. Story 32. Our system of financing public works using bonds transfers money from everyone to the wealthy. Local and state governments, as well as the federal government, issue bonds to finance projects when there is insufficient political will to fund them through taxes. The problem is that the only individuals and entities with the capital to purchase these bonds are banks, institutional and corporate investors, and affluent individuals, often operating through these investors. Bonds incur interest, so the buyers receive more money back than they originally spent. Meanwhile, bonds are repaid using taxes and other local government revenue, which the wealthy are disproportionately exempt from. Sales taxes, citations, and various local taxes are regressive, meaning that low-income individuals tend to contribute a larger proportion of their income to these taxes and citations compared to the wealthy. Overall, financing projects with bonds shifts money from the general public to the investment class. Those with money to invest are typically affluent. This system that transfers money from everyone to the wealthy is widespread. Every local government that finances projects using bonds participates in this system that enriches the affluent. Story 33. I always thought deleting history from Chrome was slower while online compared to deleting it while offline. It turns out Google was deliberately saving everyone's history. Story 34. Here's my all-time favorite. There is a direct causal link between Nazism and current management doctrines, particularly new public management. In fact, the primary reconversion for high-ranking Nazi lawmakers who escaped justice was to become teachers or directors in private business schools. They went on to heavily influence the management policies that are now widely implemented. Most famously, the term human resources originated from the Third Reich. Previous similar terms were created in Britain and France, but they were very niche and nobody in their right mind would have called humans resources. Interestingly, the first instances of a happiness manager in the workplace appeared in Nazi Germany, and there is no ambiguity about this origin. It may sound like an unhinged leftist theory, yet it is solid and well-sourced knowledge that many historians have researched. Story 35, the light bulb conspiracy. Every light bulb manufacturer in the world signed an agreement to make their light bulbs less durable. The first light bulbs were so well made that they could not break down easily, and people did not buy new ones, making it less profitable to produce light bulbs. I believe many products have operated this way ever since. Story 36. In 2016, Hillary Clinton had a deal with the Democratic National Committee, led by Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who was her co-campaign chair before becoming the committee chair. Wealthy donors could make one contribution to her campaign, the committee, and the state parties in one check. This practice was called bundling. The arrangement allowed donors to write a large check, with the maximum allowed contribution going to Hillary, another maximum to the committee, and any leftover funds directed to participating state parties. This may sound elite, but was legitimate. The problem was that 99.5% of the money intended for the state parties, to support down-ballot candidates, was instead returned to the committee, which spent it on ads similar to Hillary's, minus the message, "I'm Hillary Clinton and I approve this message." Before Debbie Wasserman Schultz, the committee chair was Tim Kaine, who stepped down to allow her to take the position. Coincidentally, he became Hillary's chosen running mate. Story 37. The United States government created a department solely dedicated to influencing the attitudes of Americans regarding dairy consumption to support its policies of artificially propping up the dairy industry through purchasing excess dairy. They launched advertising campaigns like "Got Milk" and funded the inclusion of cheese in virtually every product. I am sure this has no connection to the sharp increase in obesity rates or the honesty of the information provided to the American people. Story 38. One of the major banana companies paid the Central Intelligence Agency to overthrow the Guatemalan government because they were at risk of losing land due to regulations imposed by the Guatemalan administration. Story 39. An American company imports 100 metric tons of coca leaves into the United States every year from Peru. Pure cocaine is extracted from them and then sold to a pharmaceutical company. The cocaine-free byproduct is sold to another American corporation, all with the blessing of the United States government. Story 40. After the congressional investigation, the Federal Bureau of Investigation agreed to close down all counterintelligence programs. However, it did not agree to stop using any of the tactics in other programs. Story 41. Several companies made billions of dollars from every war in the last 120 years. Lobbyists for large businesses use nearly unlimited budgets to influence congressional decisions. Social media companies base their algorithms on maximizing user engagement at the expense of truth and safety, actively suppressing any internal movement toward reforms that could increase safety and truth, as these would decrease engagement. Most mainstream news sources are owned by a small number of extremely wealthy individuals whose agendas often align with that of Klaus Schwab, who stated, "You will own nothing and you will be happy. Everyone should eat bugs." Story 42. The weather station situated in the Outback is not a weather station. It is a spy station run by the Americans. That explains the sudden influx of Americans in Alice Springs, despite it being a town in the middle of nowhere. It turns out this information is completely true. Pine Gap is operated by the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, and several other organizations. This operation is on stolen land and was initiated by actions that potentially undermined a democracy. Story 43. The United States government has been providing news outlets with pre-packaged news stories for years. Story 44. COINTELPRO was the Federal Bureau of Investigation's program that infiltrated and attempted to dismantle civil rights groups. Some of the actions they took were absolutely unethical and very much illegal. Story 45. The sugar industry is responsible for much of the scientific literature suggesting that a high-fat diet is harmful. They did this specifically to prevent consumers from focusing on high-sugar diets, which are far worse for health. Story 46. There is an organization called the Atlas Network, which exists to set up and fund a vast network of right-wing and libertarian lobby groups around the world. Many of these groups pose as neutral academic think tanks with names like the Institute of Economic Affairs or the Center for Policy Studies, and they often appear on political discussion television shows in that guise. In fact, their job is to influence public opinion and government policy to favor the interests of those who fund them. This has involved discouraging action on climate change, criminalizing protest, and undermining legislation that protects the rights of citizens while restraining the actions of corporations. Story 47. George H.W. Bush was selected as Ronald Reagan's running mate because of his ties to the intelligence community and his ability to broker the arms for hostages deal that kept the U.S. hostages held in Iran until after the election. Story 48. The United States government used to have an agreement with American dairy farmers that milk would never fall below a certain price. If it did, the government would buy all the excess milk at an agreed-upon support price. At one point, the government had so much extra milk that they had to start turning it into cheese and giving it away to millions of people through the food stamps program, often referred to as government cheese. If you grew up poor in the 1980s or 1990s, you may remember it as being slightly better than Velveeta before it all spoiled. They had so much cheese that they started storing it in massive caves in Missouri. Today, the program is mostly dissolved, but the cheese caves still exist. They are now owned by Kraft. All the excess milk is dumped into fields because it is easier than trying to find a buyer before the milk goes bad. Story 49. I hear deceased individuals. This is because the laughter tracks recorded for comedy television shows feature people who are now all passed away. Story 50. The belief that the term conspiracy theory is associated with craziness or falsehood is misleading. Story 51. The Corfu Incident. When British forces entered Rome in 1944, they obtained the Albanian treasure from the Italian government. In 1945, after the new government in Albania was established with Hoxha as the leader, he kindly requested the return of the pre-war Albanian treasure. However, Britain refused. To justify their actions, Britain attacked its own fleet near Corfu Island 3 times and blamed Albania, all to retain possession of the treasure. The damage incurred far exceeded the value of the pre-war Albanian treasure. Story 52. I am still absolutely baffled that the general public does not know about the scope and scale of the Iran-Contra scandal. You can watch videos of Ronald Reagan and Oliver North testifying in Congress about their involvement in Central Intelligence Agency operations, smuggling drugs into the United States to raise money to arm the Nicaraguan Contras. They evade responsibility for their actions by justifying them, stating that, in their opinion, it was necessary. The reality is that anyone who does some research on this scandal ends up having their mind blown. It used to take a solid month of research to really delve into the details, but as of 2024, the only thing someone has to do is watch the series The Octopus Murders on Netflix. It will seriously blow your mind and whet your appetite. Story 53. The dolphin experiment involved a woman placed in a room flooded up to her hips, alongside a dolphin, in an attempt to teach the dolphin to communicate in English. Later, the substance LSD was administered to the dolphin to observe its reactions and whether it had any impact on its speech lessons. Story 54. One fact that sounds like a conspiracy theory but is actually true is the existence of Operation Northwoods. In the early 1960s, the United States Department of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff proposed this operation, which included plans for the Central Intelligence Agency and other operatives to commit acts of terrorism against American civilians and military targets. The purpose of these proposed actions was to create public support for a war against Cuba by blaming the acts on the Cuban government. President John F. Kennedy rejected the plans, and they were never executed. But the existence of the proposal was confirmed when the related documents were declassified in the 1990s. Story 55. Hitler and the Nazis had several United States government officials involved, including United States senators, and nearly enacted a coup against Franklin D. Roosevelt. It is the biggest conspiracy that few know about because they attempted to cover it up to avoid affecting morale during World War II. Consider listening to the podcast titled Ultra, as it is fascinating. Story 56. The issue at hand involves the impact of certain agricultural practices on health and safety. The manufacturing of pesticides and the development of genetically modified organisms, GMOs, particularly by companies like Monsanto, have raised significant concerns. This has led to severe consequences, including the damage caused by Agent Orange in Vietnam, affecting both local populations and U.S. veterans' children. While GMOs are not inherently negative, specific practices within the industry, particularly those associated with Monsanto, warrant scrutiny. The military-industrial complex has complex ties to agricultural production, and it is essential to understand the implications of these connections. Story 57. Anytime someone tries to explain how psychiatry, especially in Canada, is a manipulative practice based on pseudoscience, it raises concerns. The same society that struggles to treat diabetes is supposedly effectively treating people's brains using methods that involve no testing. Story 58. The Central Intelligence Agency conducted experiments on unknowing citizens with LSD and other drugs. The Unabomber Ted Kaczynski was a test subject. Story 59. The Book of Daniel in the Bible is a hoax written 400 years after the events it claims to describe. Most of the events it predicts in the second half of the book had just occurred when it was written, but this was not known as it gained popularity. Story 60. In the 1980s, U.S. neoconservatives decided that the Soviet Union was behind a global network of terrorism, including Islamic Jihad and the Irish Republican Army, and was using it to take over the world. The new Central Intelligence Agency director, William Casey, had read a book that claimed this and cited Central Intelligence Agency evidence. In reality, the evidence that Casey was reading was drawn from black propaganda that the Central Intelligence Agency had invented to smear Moscow. Agency operatives stated this, but Casey could not be convinced. President Reagan took Casey's fiction as fact and publicly declared that America was launching a global campaign to support groups fighting against this network. In 2001, U.S. neoconservatives decided they needed to link Saddam Hussein to the September 11th attacks in order to justify a second Gulf War. Donald Rumsfeld, previously associated with Team B in the 1970s, which claimed without evidence that the Soviet Union was outperforming the U.S. in the arms and technology races, as well as in the 1990s, when it claimed without evidence that Iran was mere years away from having intercontinental ballistic missiles that could reach the U.S. mainland, assembled a new team to use raw, unverified Central Intelligence Agency data to plot a global matrix of terrorist groups and connect Saddam Hussein as their facilitator. Story 61. Chemtrails are a real phenomenon in that our government has, on at least 2 occasions, sprayed biological agents on the population to observe the effects. Story 62. One fact that sounds like a conspiracy theory but is actually true is Project MKUltra. Project MKUltra was a covert program run by the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States, aimed at developing mind control techniques. The program started in the early 1950s and continued until the early 1970s. The agency conducted experiments on human subjects, often without their consent, using methods such as the administration of drugs, especially LSD, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, isolation, and verbal and sexual abuse. The goal was to investigate whether mind control could be achieved to improve interrogation techniques, control behavior, and enhance psychological warfare capabilities. The existence of MKUltra was revealed to the public in 1975 through investigations by the Church Committee and a presidential commission known as the Rockefeller Commission. Many records of the program were destroyed in 1973 by order of the then CIA Director Richard Helms, making a full accounting of the program's scope and activities difficult. The fact that a government agency engaged in such unethical and secretive experiments on unwitting individuals sounds like something out of a conspiracy theory, but it is a well-documented historical reality. Story 63. The United States government once secretly tested biological weapons on its own citizens. Project 112 was an overall program conducted in the 1960s and 1970s. Project Shed involved tests on Navy ships. Story 64. How fiat money works. It is simply paper and relies on people trusting that it has value. The supply can be endless, and there is no gold backing it up. Story 65. The government once conducted a secret project called MKUltra, where they experimented with mind control on unsuspecting citizens using drugs such as LSD. Story 66. The war on drugs was a way for the government to arrest and criminalize black and brown individuals, as well as anti-war activists. Nixon's top aide admitted it on tape. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.